In the deepest shadow of Barad-dûr, where no light has touched stone for 1,000 years, there burns an eye that knows no sleep. Lidless, wreathed in flame, it sweeps across the vastness of Middle-earth, piercing mountain and moor, forest and field, seeking always, watching always. Yet for all its terrible sight, this eye itself remains unseen. Behind the fire, behind the searching gaze that has haunted the dreams of kings and hobbits alike, what face truly dwells? What form houses the will that would dominate all free peoples? The question has echoed through the halls of Minas Tirith and whispered in the shadows of Rivendell for centuries. Who is Sauron? Not what he has done, his deeds are written in blood and ash across the annals of 3 ages, but who he truly is, beneath the masks he has worn, like a master of theatre donning different roles. For Sauron is both more and less than the Dark Lord of legend. He is ancient beyond mortal comprehension, yet diminished from what he once was. He is spirit made flesh, yet flesh corrupted beyond recognition. To know the enemy, we must dare to look behind the veils he himself has woven. We must trace the path from light to shadow, from creation to destruction, from the fair lord who once walked among the elves to the terrible eye that now burns in the darkness. For in understanding his masks, we might glimpse something far more disturbing than any monster. The face of what power without wisdom becomes, and what beauty without humility destroys. But our tale begins not in shadow, but in light. In the time before time, when the world was young and the very foundations of reality were being sung into existence. Here, in the timeless halls beyond the circles of the world, there dwelt a Maia whose name was Mairon. Beautiful was he among his kind, skilled beyond measure in the crafts of making and shaping. He served Olli the smith, mightiest of the valor in all works of hand and tool, and from his master he learned the secrets of metal and stone, of forge fire and the binding of elements to will. To understand the depth of Sauron's fall, we must first understand the height from which he tumbled. The Maia were the servants and helpers of the Vala, beings of pure spirit who could take physical form at need. They were, in the words of the wise, angels, though that word carries perhaps too much of our world's meaning to capture their true nature. Think rather of them as embodied thoughts of creation itself, each carrying within their essence some aspect of the music that brought all things into being. Mairon's gift was order, not the gentle order of growing things that Yavanna loved, nor the vast order of sea and sky that Ulmo commanded, but the precise, geometric order of the craftsman. He delighted in mechanisms that worked in perfect harmony, in structures that stood defiant against time and chaos. Even then, before his fall, there was perhaps something too rigid in his love of perfection, something that preferred the cleanness of straight lines to the wild beauty of a forest path. Yet he was not evil, not then. The stories tell us that he genuinely desired to order and coordinate things for the good of all inhabitants of Arda. He saw inefficiency and waste, discord and confusion, and his spirit rebelled against such imperfection. How noble this sounds, and how terribly familiar to any who have watched good intentions pave the road to tyranny. For Mairon's tragedy was not that he began in darkness, but that he began in light, and chose to dim it. The seeds of his corruption were present even in his virtue. Where Olli created with joy and let his works grow and change according to their nature, Mairon increasingly craved control over what he made. Where his master worked in harmony with the music of creation, Mairon began to hear discordant notes, not in the music itself, but in how others interpreted it. Surely, he reasoned, if all things were ordered according to his vision, suffering would end and perfection would reign. It was this desire for ultimate order for control over all variables that made him vulnerable when Melkor began to whisper in the halls of Ol. The Dark Lord spoke of efficiency achieved through dominion, of order imposed through power, of a world remade according to a single, perfect will. And Mairon, who had grown weary of the seeming chaos of free will, listened and was lost. But perfection turned to tyranny, and beauty was swallowed by shadow. Though it would be long ages before the full horror of that transformation would be revealed. For when Mairon first declared himself openly as Sauron, he did not come as monster or demon. Instead, he wore the most dangerous mask of all, that of the generous Lord, the wise counselor, the friend who offers gifts with no apparent price. In the early years of the Second Age, when the Númenóreans were yet faithful and the elves still dwelt in numbers west of the Misty Mountains, there came to the realm of Gil-galad a stranger of noble bearing. Fair was he to look upon, tall and gracious, with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages and hands that moved with the sureness of the master craftsman. He called himself Anatar, Lord of Gifts in the Sindarin tongue, and he spoke words that were like honey to those who heard them. "I come from the west," he said, though he did not claim to be of the valor, for even in deception he was too cunning for so silly detected a lie. "I have seen the glory of Valinor, and I bring knowledge that might ease the burdens of Middle-earth. For too long have the elves and the Edain struggled against the darkness that lingers still in forgotten places. Would it not be well if there were instruments of power that could preserve what is fair and good against the decay of time?" Thus spoke Anatar, and his words found fertile ground among the Noldor, who had ever been eager for knowledge and making. Had they not created the Silmarils? Had they not wrought wonders in Gondolin and Nargothrond? Here was one who understood their nature, who spoke their language of creation and craft. When he offered to teach them the making of rings of power, devices that could preserve and protect realms against the dimming of the world, many heard in his voice an echo of their own deepest desires. Yet even then, there were those who sensed something amiss in the Lord of Gifts. Gil-galad himself refused to treat with Anatar, as did Elrond, though they could not say precisely why. Perhaps it was some memory in their blood of the music of creation, some discord they detected in his too perfect speech. But in Ost-in-Edhil, the city of the elves in Eregion, Celebrimbor and his craftsmen welcomed the stranger with open arms and eager hearts. For months that stretched into years, Anatar dwelt among the Gwaith y Myrddin, the people of the jewel-smiths, sharing his knowledge freely and learning their techniques in turn. Together they wrought the rings of power, each a masterwork that captured and focused the strength of the world itself. Lesser rings they made first, and then greater, each more wonderful than the last. The 7 and the 9 took shape under Anatar's guidance, their gold and mithrils singing with contained power, their gems holding light that would not fade. But here lay the trap within the gift. For while Anatar aided in their making, he also learned their secrets, understanding each spell and ward that went into their creation. And when the work was nearly complete, he departed from Eregion with courteous thanks, claiming that urgent business called him elsewhere. Only later would the elves learn what business that had been, the forging in the fires of Mount Doom of one ring to rule them all. The beauty of Anatar's deception lay not merely in his fair form, but in how perfectly he understood the hearts of those he sought to corrupt. He offered power, yes, but he wrapped it in noble purpose. He spoke of preservation when he meant dominion, of order when he planned tyranny. His gifts came with no visible strings attached, no immediate price demanded. He was the perfect tempter because he gave his victims exactly what they thought they wanted, and only revealed the cost when it was far too late to refuse payment. But masks cannot last forever, and Anatar's beauty burned away in the fires of war when the Númenóreans came in their wrath to challenge his growing power. The fair form that had so deceived the elves was cast aside like a worn cloak when Sauron submitted to Ar-Pharazôn's might, allowing himself to be taken in chains to the Golden Isle. Yet this apparent defeat was perhaps his greatest victory, for in Númenor he donned a new mask, not of the generous friend, but of the wise counselor who spoke hard truths that pride longed to hear. To the Númenóreans, drunk on their own power and resentful of the ban of the Valar that kept them from the undying lands, Sauron whispered different poison than he had offered the elves. Where he had promised the Gwaith y Myrdain, the preservation of beauty, he offered the men of Númenor conquest over death itself. Why should you, who are greatest among the children of Ilúvatar, bow before the Valar? He asked. Are you not mighty enough to claim your birthright by force? Are you not wise enough to rule your own destiny? In the great temple he built to Melkor, amid the smoke of human sacrifice and the glitter of gold torn from distant lands, Sauron appeared again in fair form. But it was a terrible beauty now, the loveliness of the serpent that speaks sweet words while its coils tighten around the throat. He named himself Zigur, meaning wizard, and claimed to bring wisdom that the Valar had long withheld. Death, he proclaimed, was but a lie told by jealous gods to keep mortals in subjugation. The undying lands could be taken by force and their secrets plundered by those bold enough to seize them. Yet even as his corruption of Númenor reached its crescendo, Sauron knew he played a desperate game. When the great armada of Ar-Pharazôn set sail for Valinor, the Dark Lord himself remained behind, sensing perhaps that some powers even he dared not directly challenge. His prescience served him well, for when the world was changed and Númenor swallowed by the waves, he barely escaped with his life, and even then, not unchanged. The drowning of Númenor broke more than an island kingdom. It shattered the very foundations of Sauron's physical existence. The fair form of Anatar, the terrible beauty of Zigur, all were lost in the catastrophe that reshaped the world. When he returned at last to Middle-earth, it was in agony of spirit, diminished and crippled by the cosmic forces he had dared to challenge. Never again could he appear fair to the eyes of men or elves. The mask of beauty was burned away forever, leaving only the raw essence of his corrupted will, seeking new form and substance. Thus began the Third Age, and with it, Sauron's time of hiding. Gone was the tempter who walked openly among the wise. In his place rose a presence felt rather than seen, a will that worked through shadow and suggestion. He had learned the bitter lesson that direct confrontation with the powers of the West brought only ruin. Now he would be more subtle, more patient. He would gather his strength in secret places and work through servants and slaves, remaining himself hidden until the moment was right to strike. Yet still the question lingered. What form did the Dark Lord take in his diminishment? If beauty was denied to him, what shape housed his malice in the long years of the Third Age? In the watchtowers of Gondor, from the guard posts of Rohan to the hidden refuges of the rangers in the wild, one image haunted the dreams of those who kept watch against the darkness. A great eye of fire, lidless and terrible, searching always across the leagues of Middle-earth. Wreathed in flame, yet piercing as the sharpest spear, it became the very symbol of Sauron's malice, the embodiment of a will that would see all things brought under its dominion. Yet here we encounter one of the deepest mysteries of the Dark Lord's nature. Was the eye merely symbol, or was it literally the form he had taken? The question tormented scholars and lawmasters for generations, for the truth seemed to shift like shadows at twilight. In Minas Tirith's archives, Ancient texts spoke of the Dark Lord as having a body of flesh and bone, however corrupted. Orcs who had fled his service whispered of a master who commanded them from a throne of iron, whose black hand bore the ring of power. Yet others told of visions in Palantir and dreams where only the eye appeared, terrible beyond description, its gaze alone sufficient to drive strong minds to madness. The truth, as so often with the fallen Maia, was both simpler and more complex than mortals could easily comprehend. Sauron did indeed possess a physical form in the Third Age. Tolkien himself confirmed this in his letters, noting that the Dark Lord had a body of man shape, though terrible beyond description. He walked the halls of Barad-dûr on legs of flesh and bone, commanded his armies with a voice that resonated through stone and steel, and bore upon his hand the instrument of his power and his doom. But the eye was no mere metaphor. It was, in the truest sense, a projection of his will made manifest, a spiritual weapon that transcended the limitations of physical sight. Through the power of the ring and the strength of his own diminished but still formidable essence, Sauron could extend his perception across vast distances, could focus his malice into a force that pierced veils, both physical and spiritual. The eye was both symbol and reality. It represented his nature as one who watches and dominates, while also serving as the actual instrument through which that dominance was exercised. Think of it not as either body or spirit, but as both simultaneously. The eye was Sauron's truest face, the visible manifestation of what he had become, a being whose very existence was focused on the single purpose of surveillance and control. Where once Mairon had looked upon the works of creation with wonder and joy, now Sauron gazed upon Middle-earth with hunger and possessiveness. The eye was his soul made visible, stripped of all pretense and beauty, revealing the naked will to power that drove him. Yet this duality created its own form of concealment. Those who faced the eye saw what appeared to be pure malice given form, a cosmic force of destruction that seemed to have no humanity left within it. They could not imagine that behind this terrible vision stood a being not so different from themselves, one who had once known doubt and hope, who had made choices and lived with their consequences. The eye became a mask as effective as any fair form, hiding not the monster within, but the fallen angel who was perhaps more terrifying still. For if Sauron were merely evil incarnate, he could be dismissed as something alien and incomprehensible. But the truth, that he remained recognizably a person, however corrupted, forced those who truly understood to confront an uncomfortable question. What separated them from his fate? What choices? What desires? What pride might lead any of them down a similar path? If he had a body, then what did it look like in his final years, when the eye burned brightest above Barad-dûr and the shadows of Mordor stretched longest across Middle-earth? The fragments we possess paint a picture both fascinating and terrible, drawn from scattered references in ancient texts and the terrified whispers of those few who claimed to have witnessed his presence and lived to speak of it. In the deep places beneath the Dark Tower, where even the bravest of his servants feared to tread uninvited, Sauron walked in a form that bore the memory of his former majesty, twisted into nightmare. Tall he remained, for he had ever preferred to appear in stature greater than that of elves or men. But it was the terrible height of the predator, all angles and menace. His skin, once fair beyond the beauty of the firstborn, now bore the pallor of one who had not known true sunlight for an age of the world. Some said it had the texture of old parchment, stretched too thin a croix-museur, os bones that jutted like blade edges beneath the surface. The Dark Lord's eyes, his physical eyes, not the great eye of flame that was his spiritual projection, were said to burn with a light that owed nothing to warmth or life. They were like coals in a forge that had burned too long and too hot, holding fire but no comfort, illumination, but no wisdom. Those few servants granted audience in his presence reported that to meet that gaze directly was to feel one's very thoughts laid bare and judged, not for their righteousness or their folly, but for their usefulness to his designs. His hands drew particular mention in the fragments that have come down to us, for they remain the hands of the craftsman he had once been, though turned now to purposes of domination rather than creation. Long-fingered and precise in their movements, they could shape the very substance of matter through will alone, but also, more terrifyingly, reach into the minds and souls of those before him, adjusting and reshaping with the same cold precision he had once brought to metalwork. Upon the middle finger of his right hand sat the ring of power, seeming almost small and plain against the terrible majesty of its bearer, yet pulsing with a malice that made even the Dark Lord's presence seem diminished by comparison. His voice, when he chose to speak rather than command through the silent pressure of his will, carried echoes of the music of creation. But it was music played in a minor key, harmonies turned to discord, melodies that spoke of beauty only to reveal the ugliness they concealed. Some who heard him said that his words seemed to bypass the ears entirely, resonating instead in the very bones of those who listened. Others reported that he could speak in any tongue that had ever been devised, switching between the ancient Quenya of the elves and the base speech of orcs with equal fluency. All languages seemed somehow diminished and corrupted when they passed his lips. Yet perhaps most unsettling of all was the sense reported by those in his presence that they stood before someone who was simultaneously more and less than he appeared. The physical form was clearly mighty, clearly terrible, but it was also clearly not the entirety of what Sauron had become. His true presence seemed to extend beyond the boundaries of flesh, filling the chamber and pressing against the minds of all within it. The body was both prison and projection, containing only a fraction of a will that had grown too vast and too malevolent to be fully housed in any single form. This, then, was perhaps the most cunning mask of all, a form that appeared to reveal everything while actually concealing the most disturbing truth. For those who faced him saw a monster, a dark lord, a being clearly beyond redemption or sympathy. They did not see the choices that had led to this state, the small compromises and justified cruelties that had accumulated over millennia into this final degradation. They could not glimpse the Maia Mairon who still existed somewhere within this shell, perhaps screaming silently at what he had become, perhaps long since reconciled to his fate. And yet, to understand his mask, we must also face the question of his true self, for beneath all the forms he wore, beneath fair Anatar and terrible eye alike, there remained something that no disguise could fully conceal or transformation completely erase. Strip away the beauty and the horror, the majesty and the malice, and what remains at the core of Sauron's being is perhaps the most disturbing truth of all. He is, at his essence, still recognizably the person he chose to become. The great tragedy of Sauron, and perhaps the key to understanding why his story has echoed through the ages with such power, is not that he became something alien and incomprehensible, but that he remained fundamentally himself, even as he destroyed everything good within that self. The order-loving Maia who served Ole was still there in the Dark Lord who built Barad-dûr. The craftsman's precision still guided the hand that forged the One Ring. The desire to coordinate and improve still drove the will that sought to dominate all Middle-earth. But here lies the most chilling recognition. Sauron's evil was not the result of corruption imposed from without, but of choices made from within. Melkor had whispered, yes, but Mairon had listened. The path from servant of creation to lord of destruction was paved not with moments of dramatic betrayal, but with small compromises, reasonable justifications, and the slow erosion of principles that had once seemed unshakable. Consider the progression. He began by believing that his vision of order was superior to the apparent chaos of free will. This led him to value control over consent, efficiency over freedom, his judgment over the choices of others. Each step seemed logical, given the previous one, each decision justified by the noble goal of reducing suffering and maximizing benefit for all. Yet each step also led further from the light, until the end result bore no resemblance to the benevolent intention that had begun the journey. The masks Sauron wore, fair lord, wise counselor, terrible eye, were not disguises in the truest sense, but rather different aspects of the same fundamental corruption. They were the faces he showed to different audiences, each designed to achieve the same ultimate goal through different means. Anatar offered partnership while planning dominion. Zigur promised wisdom while delivering slavery. The Eye projected power while concealing weakness. Yet behind all of them stood the same essential choice, the preference for his will over the freedom of others. This is why Sauron could never be redeemed, not because he lacked the power to change, but because he refused to acknowledge that change was necessary. To accept redemption would require admitting that his entire worldview was flawed, that the millennium of choices he had made were wrong, that the suffering he had caused was not justified by the order he sought to create. The very pride that had led him to rebel against the music of creation prevented him from harmonizing with it again. In the end, his greatest mask was perhaps the one he wore for himself, the belief that he remained the hero of his own story, the necessary force of order in a chaotic universe, the one being with the wisdom and strength to impose the peace that lesser minds could not achieve on their own. Behind this final self-deception, the Maia Mairon remained, not destroyed, but imprisoned by his own choices, chained by pride to a throne that had become his cell. The masks of Sauron have fallen, each in its turn revealed as hollow artifice concealing the same essential truth. The generous Lord of Gifts crumbled when his ring was forged. The wise counselor of Númenor burned away in the world's changing. The terrible Eye itself was but one more facade, hiding not a monster beyond comprehension, but something far more unsettling, the remnant of what had once been noble, now twisted beyond recognition by its own choices. Standing in the ruins of Barad-dûr after the ring's destruction, one might have expected to find the remains of some great demon or cosmic force of evil. Instead, there would have been only silence. The silence of a will that had sustained itself for millennia on pride and domination, finally bereft of the power that had given it meaning. For Sauron's tragedy was not that he had become something other than himself, but that he had become too perfectly, too completely, exactly what he had chosen to be. In his story, we glimpse a mirror that reflects uncomfortable truths about the nature of corruption itself. Evil, the tale whispers, does not usually announce itself with horns and pitchfork. More often it comes wearing the mask of pragmatism, speaking the language of necessity, promising order in exchange for freedom, safety in return for choice. It begins with the reasonable observation that surely someone wise enough and strong enough could arrange things better than the chaos of competing wills allows. It ends with the Eye that sees all but understands nothing, the ring that controls all but creates nothing, the Dark Lord who rules over a realm of ash and shadow. Yet perhaps the most profound lesson hidden in Sauron's masks lies not in their revelation of evil's methods, but in their demonstration of its essential sterility. For all his power, all his cunning, all his ages of scheming and planning, what did the Dark Lord actually create? Barad-dûr rose by his will, but it was a tower built only to oversee destruction. The One Ring concentrated power beyond imagining, but it was power with no purpose beyond its own exercise. His armies were vast, but they existed only to tear down what others had built. The masks were themselves symbols of this sterility. Beautiful forms that concealed emptiness, wise words that led only to slavery, terrible majesty that inspired only fear. Behind each facade lay not some grand alternative vision, but merely the absence of vision, the replacement of creation with control, of growth with dominion, of the eternal dance of free will with the static perfection of absolute rule. This is why, in the end, Sauron could be defeated not by matching his power, but by choosing differently than he had chosen, by selecting sacrifice over domination, trust over control, the uncertain path of freedom over the seeming security of tyranny. The hobbits who destroyed his ring succeeded not because they were stronger than the Dark Lord, but because they embodied everything he had ceased to be: humble rather than proud, loyal rather than grasping, content with small joys rather than consumed by vast ambitions. The question that began our journey, who stands behind the mask of Sauron, thus receives its answer not in the revelation of some hidden identity, but in the recognition that there was, in truth, nothing hidden at all. The masks were the message, the disguises were themselves the deepest truth. Behind the face of evil, we find not some cosmic force of darkness, but the shadow of choices made and paths taken, the echo of what any of us might become if we choose power over love, control over trust, our will over the greater music of which we are all part. How often does evil hide behind a face it cannot bear to reveal? The answer whispers back from every age, always and never. Always, because no corruption is ever complete enough to destroy entirely the memory of what was lost. Never, because the face evil wears is always, ultimately, its own, the true face of what pride and power and the refusal to bend make of even the most beautiful spirit. In seeing Sauron clearly, we see not a monster, but ourselves. And in that recognition lies perhaps the only protection against following where his choices led. The eye has closed, the tower has fallen, the ring lies melted in the fires where it was made. But the choice remains eternal, offered new to each heart in each moment, to create or to control, to serve the music or to sing alone, to wear the masks of power or dare to show the world our true and vulnerable faces. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you. Type in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you.